Nice to see you all. And yeah, just as sort of a reminder, yeah, I wear lots of hats at AFT as our director for our Women for the Land initiative and working with historically underserved producers, but also get to use my sociology hat and do a lot of our impact evaluation work. So you all graciously responded to your pre-surveys, and we'll be responding to a post-survey. And over the course of the next year, we'll be taking part in some of our evaluation efforts. One of them might be participating in an optional interview with us in a year's time. And we just wrapped that up with some other participants from our first training, and it was a really wonderful experience. So you'll see me a few more times related to our impact evaluation work. And great audience of folks to work with. I've just been so excited about the work that we're doing here. So without further ado, I will jump in. We're still waiting on a couple of our panelists to join, and but we have two of them here, so we're gonna keep cruising. And if anyone has survived, as we all have, if we're in this room here today, the last couple of years, we've learned to be very flexible and nimble to what life throws at us. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my slides. I'm going to be talking about kind of working with diverse owners and operators in the context of, soil health work, land preservation, but I'm zooming out a little bit just to think about kind of working with that particular audience and the particular challenges and opportunities that might exist there. I know you all come from a diversity of experiences and backgrounds and may already be working deeply with what we would consider historically underserved or socially disadvantaged producers, the definition of which I'll get into in a minute. But also some of you might be thinking that you want to do more work in this space and looking for some resources and support. So I'm not going to talk at you for too long, and my hope is that we'll have a panel discussion with a few guests here today, as well as a little bit of time for breakouts for you to kind of workshop ideas you have, challenges you've had. So we'll kind of do a randomly assigned set of breakouts towards the end of the session. So be jotting down kind of your own personal challenges or questions that you have that will kind of inform those breakouts. And certainly there'll be a bit of time for Q&A based on our presentation, but my hope is that there's some good time just for discussion as well. So let me get to sharing my screen. Here we go. So I assume you can see that. You see that, Beth, Jamie? Okay, I see Jamie. Okay, great. So I just gave you the overview. So let me just start my slide. All right, so just, because I direct the Women for Land Initiative, just like to share a little bit more about what we do. We're working with women farmers and landowners to protect their land, embrace conservation, and really thinking about how to stay on the land and be successful and thrive in, increasingly challenging times. So our work is, we do a lot of work across the country. And increasingly are working with an audience of kind of non-operating landowners to women, farmers, principal operators, as well as aspiring producers. So it's always nice just to kind of give some definitions here. You might hear me say historically underserved, marginalized, socially disadvantaged farmers. Sometimes I use those kind of terms interchangeably. They don't always mean the exact same thing, but generally speaking, when we think about how the USDA defines this, we can kind of see the list of folks who are included in this definition of socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and there are particular programs specific to supporting these communities. Important to note, since I work so much with women, women are not always included in this group, neither are sort of LGBTI and others who identify as queer, bisexual, beyond. And so that's just something to kind of think about in terms of who gets kind of binned in these categories and who doesn't. But it's just something to kind of hold in that back pocket as you think about reaching out to more diverse farmers and ranchers and landowners. So just to provide a little bit more context of kind of working with diverse land ownership, I have a a map here of female operated farms as a percent of total farms by county, and that's from 2017 Ag Census. And that just kind of gives you a sense of kind of where women are. And you can see in many places it makes up a large percentage of the producers. But when we think about just, there's lots of ways we can kind of think about diversity on the landscape. But a couple kind of points that I wanted to make in this context is, we think about rented land and how much land in the US is rented. 40% of that land, nearly half of that rented land is owned by women. So we know they have this sort of outsized role in land ownership. Predominantly land that is rented out, which very much can include land that's under easement. 36% of the country's producers are women, but more than half of all farms in the US have a female producer. And then when we think about folks who identify as non-white, less than 2% of landowners in the US are non-white, but certainly depending on where you are, there's a lot that we don't get to see. So in parts of the country, that land ownership rate is higher, although still quite low, unfortunately. But when we think about the future of farming, as 40% of farmland is expected to change hands in the next few decades, we see that new and beginning farmer group is much more diverse, and many more folks who identify sort of in those socially disadvantaged producer categories are making up that next generation of farms. So really important to think about that transition and why it's so important to be working with more diverse landowners and aspiring producers. So just a little bit in terms about why non-operating landowners. This is an area that I focus quite a bit on. Lisa, hopefully if she joins us, will speak to this a little bit as well. But thinking again about this audience of folks who own land, but predominantly rent it out. Again, that's nearly 50% of the total farmland owned in the US. And we know based on some of our research that we've conducted here at AFT that there's high levels of trust in farm operators. These NOLs are willing to make changes to support conservation practices. They want to keep farmland in farming. They want to think about who the next sort of generation is that's taking over, that are often much less kind of formally educated around agricultural topics and have much less experiences associated with farming directly, and so rely heavily on their tenants to make decisions, which in the case of some gender and racial dynamics can lead to sort of power imbalances, but also means that this audience is kind of underserved when thinking about both preservation and conservation goals. And we published a report that goes into this audience a lot more, both men and women, but it's worth kind of diving into more if folks are kind of working with those audiences, which I presume some of you are. And particularly parts of the country, as I noted, the statistic is quite high, but if you look in the majority of the Corn Belt and the Midwest in particular, very high rates of rented land and higher rates of these sort of non-operating landowners who own land and rent it out, mostly to custom producers. And then just thinking a little bit about kind of the barriers that women face in particular. Again, this is sort of the work that I spent a lot of time doing, but just as a reminder that we've come a long way in terms of women's space in agriculture, in terms of being sort of the lead decision maker on farms, but we continue through our work with learning circles and peer-to-peer education. Women continue to face barriers and are often kind of excluded from mainstream agricultural spaces. Many of the women, have inherited the land from a spouse or a family member. And you can see some of these quotes, I feel like there's some kind of secret society that I don't belong to. I have to remind my advisors that I'm the landowner, not my husband. To this quote that, my husband died last month and I don't know where to start. So we have women coming to us to get resources because they haven't been able to navigate some of the other resources as effectively as they might hope. So we know there continue to be barriers across the country and in particularly different spaces and different demographics are facing unique challenges associated with their either land tenure situation or their experience and background in agriculture. A few additional kind of facts on women in agriculture, share this piece around the ASAP easements. Nearly half of those easements are held by women or women-run organizations, at least based on the data that we were able to synthesize for this slide. And for the years presented here. Women primary producers represent greater racial and ethnic diversity. So again, those diverse sort of socially disadvantaged producer, different identities that women have often, all of those things are sort of layered in terms of how women are navigating challenges. And that next generation and current generation of women producers are more diverse than previous years, and more diverse in some ways than their sort of male counterparts. And then when we look at sort of inequity in agriculture, recent really interesting research looked at agriculture and farming as the most unequal professions in the United States, and that's based both on race and gender demographics. And when we look at women-run farms, they operate on smaller acreage, and even when we control for acreage and farm system, they often earn 40% less farm income than farms operated by men after controlling for other characteristics. So, and another paper that's just coming out from a researcher in University of Idaho continues to bear that point out of just how kind of unequal from an income perspective agriculture is. And then we know that women-led farms are often very impacted by lack of access to childcare or other care expectations or healthcare needs and requirements of the family, often impacting women-led farms more so than others. And then just to sort of layer on, there's so many things we could talk about, but I don't want to talk to you this whole time. But just to kind of layer on these other pieces that we know that Black, Indigenous, people of color, using this term BIPOC here, producers may face even more challenges in terms of both land access, land ownership structure, as well as discrimination. Raising a couple points here that I'm sure will be picked up on by some of our panelists later. Heirs property issues, for those of you who aren't familiar with, is a form of fractionated property ownership that occurs when an owner passes away without a will, and there is kind of difficult in sort of getting that land ownership allocated to family members in an equitable way. Often means land loss. And it particularly impacts the Southeast and Black farmers, but it impacts many farmland owners across the country. You can see just kind of this quota here, heirs property is making up, 3.5 million acres across the South and more than a third of Southern Black owned land. So incredible impacts. Some legislation has been put in place, the Uniform Partition of Heirs Act, which Ebony Alexander, who's part of your all trainee team and on our panel, might speak more to, but as a way to address some of those barriers. But it's still an issue that deeply affects folks and affects folks differently depending on what state they live in. And then, I just raised some of the kind of discrimination that farmers of color, particularly African American and Native American farmers, have faced in the context of accessing USDA resources. You can look more into the Pigford versus Blickman, one of the largest kind of civil rights payment that went out to farmers who experienced discrimination at the hands of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And if you talk to farmers of color today, they're still facing some of that in local county offices. So it's all to say that we know these challenges still exist for women, for farmers of color, and they're layered and intersectional in terms of how they impact you depending on where you live, what resources you have, what communities you're connected to. A couple of things that I like to raise in the context of this conversation is just that sort of land loss piece, particularly when you look at African American land loss, 90% of that land lost in the last century. The intergenerational wealth that was lost as a result of that. And there are some folks in the land trust work and who are also thinking about things like land loss, land back, and reparations in the context of how do we sort of diversify again land ownership, knowing that land was stolen or lost through many of the many of the things I've raised here. So it's a huge topic and lots of things to digest, but I'm going to stop talking kind of formally with my slides and kind of get into talking a little bit more about our panelists who are here today. Beth, can you let me know if, did we gain anybody? Did Lisa or Seneca join us?
They have not yet.
Okay. All right. So I might, I don't know what happened to them. Hopefully everyone's okay. So I'll maybe move through their slides kind of quickly on the introductions. I have Ebony here. I know Ebony's probably already introduced herself to all of you, and I'm not going to read all of these bios because it would take us too long. But Ebony, as the leader of the Black Family Land Trust, has done incredible work in the land preservation world and is a partner of ours with Women for the Land, implementing a number of programs in the Southeast with us, and really exciting to kind of see that work grow in partnership with Ebony and her team. And our new team member, Nicole Guashiri, who's here and in the training as well. But one thing I might just mention is Ebony was named the 2022-2023 Kingsbury Brown Fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and she's a recipient of the Conservation Leadership Award from the Land Trust Alliance this last year. There's a beautiful video, wish we had time to share with it, but Ebony has been doing amazing work in this space for a long time. And then Lisa, if she joins us, just mentioned she's a farmer and a grassroots organizer around both kind of cottage food industry. She wrote a book called Soil Sisters and as a toolkit for women farmers, and really leading that kind of sharing that happens with women in rural landscapes, and works both as a contractor with Renewing the Countryside and runs her operation with her husband in Wisconsin, and can provide a lot of that insight of working with the non-operating landowners, working with women producers, and kind of facilitating connections between rural community members, many of whom are also underserved in this context. So hopefully Lisa joins. Seneca Heron, who is the founder of the Freedman Ayers Foundation. She is an economist, has worked for the USDA as well as academia, and she has kickstarted this new organization that's promoting the prominence, profitability, and expansion of African-American farms in the US. Seneca is a great collaborator as well, and if she doesn't join, we'll share everyone's contact information if people want to be more in touch. And then Tony, I think most of you have met him as well as part of your team here and as conservation director with Groundswell. And Tony has done a lot of work in schoolyards in Madison's community schools, but is also deeply passionate about connecting people to the outside and to the land. So I'm really sort of honored to have this awesome group of collaborators here and panelists who I'd really like to ask them some questions. So right now, I think it's just Ebony and Tony who are here with us, and we'll get started with the questions. Like I said, if our other panelists join, we'll include them in the conversation. So I want to get started, and I think what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my screen just because it'll be easier to interact. But my first question, and I'll also put this in the chat in case our panelists need to refer back to it, but I'd love to ask, maybe we'll start with Ebony. I started with your slide. Could you share a little bit of some of the lessons that you've learned from working with and engaging diverse producers and landowners? And Tony, you can be up after Ebony, but I'll stop sharing this way we can see each other a little bit better.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And good afternoon, everyone. I think one of the most important lessons for me in the work that I do is that our core clients are older. They are typically, they work 2 jobs. They have limited access to technology. They make less than $25,000 a year from their agricultural enterprise. And they have 180 acres or less. So when you look at that, one of the challenges that we have as we're providing technical assistance to our landowners is helping them to understand that it's a different day, helping them to understand that technology can help them increase both their yields as well as their productivity, particularly when you look at what we're doing now, learning more about soil health, how we can improve soil, how that helps them. We also have to help them appreciate that although their grandfathers and fathers were very successful at what they did, you can't continue to do it the same old way that they did it. There's a new way to do it. We jokingly say to our generational producers, it's not your granddaddy's farm anymore. So let's look at doing it a little bit differently. We also are challenged with a trust factor. As Gabrielle said when she was doing her introduction, many of our landowners simply don't trust anybody, and that is inclusive of me. It takes me a while to build trust with our landowners. I have to act as an intermediary between USDA and state departments of agriculture for some of our landowners. They'd rather do without and suffer than to have to deal with government or with people that they don't trust. And then there's the other thing that we have to combat is just people having basic respect in how they talk to our landowners. You can't talk at them or to them, but you have to talk with them. And that's a challenge. We spend so much of our time working with USDA to help them appreciate that everybody's not going to say the same thing the same way. You know, the classic example I always use is, you know, USDA will say, if you need water, if you need a well, then you have a resource issue. For our small farmers, that's not a resource issue. They need water. And when they go in and they speak to USDA, they say, I need water because I'm dry cropping. Oftentimes in North Carolina and Virginia, where we work primarily, what they'll get back from USDA is, oh, we don't have a water program. Knowing that had the person asked the question differently, they would have gotten a different answer. So I guess for us, our challenge that we have and what we have learned is we sit second chair, using the legal term second chair. We sit second chair to all of our clients when they are new, as we're building relationships and we have to send them into USDA, we go with them. We never send anybody in just cold to USDA because only God knows what they'll hear. And then as they begin to develop more relationships and they begin to get more comfortable, we don't go as often. But our role really is to help them build a level of comfort and trust with government, as well as to interpret what they thought they heard and what they heard. And that is just a big challenge because we all don't hear, we all don't process the same way. And because of the tone that some of the people have taken with our landowners, they often feel that they're spoken down to, so they won't ask the question, they won't challenge. They'll just leave, throw their hands up in frustration and say, I'm not dealing with USDA again.
So I can just jump in here. I want to echo everything that Ebony just said. So Groundswell Conservancy, we've been operating in Madison, Wisconsin since 1983. We've got about 90 conservation easements. 44 of those are farmland conservation easements, which began in 1999. So we've started doing farmland conservation since 1999. All of those farm easement landowners and operators are white, middle-aged to retirement age people. And we deal with some amount of working with women farmers, working with younger farmers who are looking at more agricultural entertainment and tourism and some more entrepreneurial type stuff that we're trying to navigate. But we realized several years ago that certainly the farming population doesn't represent the population statistics of the area that we live in. So one of our first challenges was figuring out who we were leaving out in farmland, you know, who doesn't have access to farmland. So Groundswell began a program creating equitable access to farmland. And we currently have 2 farms that serve BIPOC and New American farmers. And when I say BIPOC, we have a Black farmer who's working on the south side of Madison with some incredible programs. He rents the land from us for $1 for 20 years or whatever it is. And exactly as Ebony has said, any sort of soil conservation practices or practices, environmentally sound practices that we want to see on the property, we are sitting second chair. We are working with NRCS. We are working with FSA to make that stuff happen. And one of the sad realities of that situation is we have been trying to get water to this farmer since 2019. Incredibly, you know, this is where like racism shows its head. There are nearby neighbors that have wells that have been installed at their homes. He is trying to install a well for his farm. And we've been navigating this for 3 years. And this is something that, you know, if we were to choose to go to court, is like a prime for our state Supreme Court kind of a situation. Basically, you know, a farmer reaches out to one of these government agencies, and if they're, like Ebony said, if they don't speak the same way or understand the same way, they're kind of brushed off and left to interpret whatever that message was. And Groundswell tries to help do some of that interpretation and tries to navigate some of that process. When I say New American farmers, we are working with Hmong farmers on the north side of Madison. And both of these areas that I mentioned, south side of Madison, north side of Madison, areas that are large minority populations. And I use the term, Gabrielle, historically excluded, intentionally left out of these conversations of access to farmland. So we're working with Hmong farmers on the north side of Madison. Same thing, access to land. Our model that we're working on, or we're trying to develop right now, is land access, then land tenure, then land ownership. Land ownership is something we haven't tackled yet. We have given land tenure to the Hmong farmers, but you can imagine some of the barriers there are similar, but also if English is not your first language, if English is not the first language of anyone in your family, who can you go to interpret the resources that may have made their way to you? You know, if they have made their way to you, you're not going to understand those resources, or you'll have a more difficult time understanding those resources and next steps. And Groundswell has sort of stepped in and tried to fill in that gap as well. So those are some of the challenges. There's a lot more.
Thank you for that, Tony and Ebony. Well, since you all kind of delved into some of the challenges, I'd love for you to reflect on, you know, what are the ways, you've kind of touched a little bit on ways that you're supporting folks to overcome these challenges, but can you reflect a little bit more on the ways that people are kind of navigating this, this exclusion, this discrimination, and ways that might be working for them, or ways that give you some hope and inspiration from what might work for others? Either of you want to jump in first, go for it.
I have to say, in North Carolina, my sense of FSA is not positive. We are still facing just basic challenges. We have an office. I'll give you a classic example. We got a call from NRS asking us to get people enrolled in a certain program that was time limited. We identified at least 21 landowners that fit the profile. Some of them were in one particular county in Eastern North Carolina. We sent them in to get farm and tract numbers, and I say sent because it was COVID and we couldn't go with them. And they were told by the FSA person that, and this was in July, we don't give out farm and tract numbers again until October. So from July until October, they weren't going to give out farm and tract numbers. The same office has told, we did a Women in the Land meeting and went through having filled out applications on the Zoom as we were doing it. One of our landowners took it into that same office and came back with, well, you're not eligible. When we know that they were, we went through step by step, completing the application, and the application was still turned down. So I don't know. What we do is we have built alliances with leadership at the state level, with USDA and NRCS and FSA in particular, so that we can pick up the phone and call and say, listen, we're having a problem here. Can you help us? And that has been probably the most successful thing that we've done. That and, you know, something as simple, I don't know, Tony, if you have a challenge with this, but when we say to our landowners, please don't leave a USDA office without your receipt for service, and make sure that you read that receipt for service before you leave to make sure that what it has on it is in fact the service that you came in for, and not just say that you came into the office. And we have gotten so much blowback from USDA offices about giving receipt for services. But they now, I think, to some of the offices that we work with a lot, have gotten more tolerant of us and are beginning to see us more as a partner than as an enemy. But that has taken, you know, a long time to get there, and really having to have had lots of little sit-down meetings with people talking about what your children are doing or what your garden looks like or anything other than the work to build relationships with them. So I guess that's what we're doing, and it is having some impact, measurable impact. But USDA, like every place else, is a revolving door in many of those positions.
Yeah, you know, other than our challenges that we've had with water, actually at the two farms that I talked about, dealing with any sort of application process for any sort of soil health benefits or farm benefits of any kind has been a struggle for our farmers as well. You know, just Groundswell acknowledges that we have to do, if we're going to be involved in that work, and we're going to be involved in being in, you know, in environmental justice and farm justice, that we have to be there for the long haul. So we are doing an awful lot of translating of documents. And, you know, if a farmer gets an email or doesn't get the email about a program that they would be interested in, we are there to explain the program and do some of that reaching out on behalf of the landowner when we can. So I guess that's the only thing I can add, but I echo again what Ebony's saying. We're living some of that experience in Wisconsin as well.
Fortunate that those themes kind of connect in very different geographies, right? That these, you know, and having done even more work, you know, specifically with women producers, you know, we often get the question of, you know, like, oh, well, you know, like, is this work needed or relevant everywhere in the country? Or, you know, like, there's just oftentimes that kind of perception, like it's a problem over there, but not here. And I guess what we consistently see is that a lot of these same themes emerge wherever we're working in the country. Obviously, there's different flavors. And, you know, we've definitely, just to echo some of what Ebony suggested, like we found some really wonderful allies in some of our technical service providers. And ways that we've helped to encourage folks to find those folks who can be an advocate or at least an ally for them as they're navigating tricky situations. And that seemed to be a really kind of productive area. But as Ebony noted, there are those good staff, don't always stay, or they might shift positions, or, they may not serve the county that you're in. But there has been some real benefit, I think, for folks, especially who've kind of not navigated a lot of these formal institutions well, to have a face or two that they can relate to, that can help them answer their questions, and who are, frankly, quite generous with their time and resources to help people in the process. We've definitely found that to be supportive. So I guess my next question is a little bit more about kind of the theme of this whole session, or this training, is this sort of integration with soil health stewardship and farmland preservation. I think, Tony, you made the point, and it affirmed some of my slides just about, how kind of disconnected a lot of these diverse communities are from land preservation and existing easements. We find that it's still overwhelmingly more white, maybe not as male dominated, but certainly on a racial element. Or from that perspective, we see that there's, a lot of work to be done to sort of diversify that community of folks. And I think you could argue in a lot of at least the stories that we tell about soil health stewardship and people who we uplift as leaders in this space, still, in the Women for the Land work, we're constantly trying to uplift women's voices in that space, because it still tends to be kind of a white dominated male space in a lot of ways, and we're trying to diversify those stories. So that's a long-winded way of me getting around to my next question to you all, is just like, what opportunities do you see for engaging more diverse audiences, the communities that you work with, in more soil health stewardship and farmland preservation efforts? And I know land access is tied up in some of that as well, but I'd love your reflections there.
Tony, you should go first.
So Groundswell Conservancy is, I mentioned previously, we've been working on land access, which is, some amount of access to land to do farming. And then land tenure is long-term access to the land, so that those farmers know that the land won't be taken away from them. And they can invest in the land, invest in things like water, invest in soil health practices that they know they might receive the benefit from. And then that last piece is land ownership, which we haven't fully figured out yet. It is still fairly new for us, but this is a model that we're moving forward with. So as far as how are we engaging these audiences, we're really diving into creating more of that land access and land tenureship, and then ownership. We are diving into that and bringing along with that all of the, everything we're learning in this discussion as well about soil health. So those resources that we gather, when a landowner reaches out to us, we will work with them and we'll tell them, hey, here's what we want to see on the property if we're going to help you get land tenure or land ownership. And I think most farmers that we work with are amenable to that. And there are an awful lot of people looking for land access, at least in our area. So we are in an area, and this is probably pretty similar to a lot of more urban areas, where any piece of farmland that is sold is mostly sold to a developer. And the remaining farmland is kind of fought for by the small farms that made it big and are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's not a lot of room for smaller farms or someone to get into farming. So there's an awful lot of appetite that we've discovered for farming by BIPOC and New American farmers. So yeah, I guess that's what I can say is we're moving forward on this model. Groundswell is purchasing land to make available to farmers of color and New American farmers, and we're bringing these resources with us and saying, these are the great things that we want to see. We'll teach you how to do them. We'll walk you through the process, that kind of thing.
So I like what you're doing, and I'd like to hear more about your model for how you're purchasing land and reselling. I'm going to take two approaches to it. One, to the question, Gabrielle. One is, for our landowners who have heirs property, our goal is to work with them to make sure that that land stays in the family, as they resolve and work through the ownership of the land. And that can take, 6 months, or it can take 6 years. It is a very lengthy and expensive process. And it is one that can be very trying. But if we have ag land, particularly if they're good soils, some of our small acreage farmers are on some of the best soils in our state. And we're trying as hard as we can to make sure that we're not losing those soils to something else, primarily bricks and mortar development. So we work very closely to help resolve the heirs property and then help the families figure out, how do we keep this from being a cyclical event, heirs property based on generations. So we have a legal services team in Virginia that works with us to, one, resolve the heirs property, but two, also to go the next step to answer the so what question of, how do you hold this land going forward? Should it be held as a private individual or individuals? Should it be an LLC? Should it be a trust? So we have a team of people that's working with us now, and we're continuing to refine this. The thing that I'm learning is that, particularly in Virginia, because we're building infrastructure in Virginia, unlike North Carolina, we're in a constant state of improvement. We're constantly improving on the products that we have. So for heirs property, we have a whole legal services component to do that. And then part of that, as I said, also will go to our other landowners who need that legal advice to retain that land asset. They need legal advice on understanding how you put together a hunt club, or what a lease really means. How do you form the LLC? How do you form the trust? All of those things. So we're putting that together for that. But I think for our landowners who own their land and are continuing to work on their land, our challenge is helping them to generate revenue, and to generate revenue that makes sense. And I think an opportunity, and you knew I was going to do this because when you asked me this, so don't be shocked. I think that there's this excellent opportunity for USDA to create an Office of Small Farms, and look at acreage and not ownership. Small farms, 180 acres or less. And what does that mean? Because our small farmers in Virginia and North Carolina can't compete against larger landowners and producers. So they're locked out, and we're forcing them almost to sell because they can't generate revenue from their land. It's not a performing asset. Then I think there's also the opportunity for USDA to look at, and everybody who does easements, to look at easements a little bit more strategically. We hold an easement, an old FRPP easement on a small acreage farm, and it's the first and only FRPP easement on an African-American held farm. That's just not acceptable. And when you look at a program that's been around since the mid-90s, it simply isn't acceptable. But why not be more strategic? Again, it goes back to small acreage. easements like to swoop up, hundreds of acres at one time. And I understand it from a cost benefit analysis. You have to do the same amount of work for a 200-acre easement as you have to do for a 20-acre easement. But let's look at it from the perspective of heirs property. If we have heirs property and we have 5 heirs and everybody owns 20 acres, why not strategically attempt to put easements on that 20 acres, on 2 or 3 of those 20-acre plots, to make development less appealing to developers for the remaining? Yeah, you have to do the same amount of work, but is our goal to protect the land, or is our goal to save manpower hours? I don't know how to frame that. So when I say I see opportunities, these are all opportunities that I see that we can engage. We can engage our local or our state departments of agriculture to recognize that they too have a service gap. When the previous administration in Virginia came in, we worked with the Secretary of Agriculture to do a listening tour into BIPOC communities. And one of the things that she was shocked to learn is that for many communities of color, they couldn't differentiate between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Virginia Department of Agriculture. They thought that they were the same department, that they were the same entity. So that's an educational opportunity, and we were able to help bridge a little bit that gap and lack of understanding. So those are all opportunities that I see that we can do. And we have to recognize that there is a cultural difference in how we see and operate in this sector of agriculture in BIPOC community versus traditionally white communities. That's not taking anything from anybody else, or that's not asking for anything special. But I think we just have to recognize that there is a cultural difference. And the cultural difference is what is preventing us, I think, from working more effectively. Opportunity.
Were you trying to jump in there, Tony?
Something Ebony said just made me think, I go do our annual monitoring of our easements every year, and all of our older easements don't allow for mobile homes or affordable homes, really. That is insane to me, that was ever a restriction or a covenant in an easement. And, in speaking with NRCS, they will not, or USDA, they will not amend a conservation easement unless it's in the public interest. Something like eminent domain occurs, and then they'll amend a conservation easement. So you've got these lasting perpetual documents out there that are excluding people who are socially disadvantaged, or makes the most sense to have a mobile home instead of what we a lot of times see, which is a 5,000 square foot home on these properties. So it's just it's amazing to me. So some of that stuff is built in from decades ago too.
Well, I think we'll have some time for a little bit of question. I see Marie has her hand up. I want to just interject something because it ties in nicely with where the conversation's gone. And then we can take Marie's question, then we'll do some breakouts. But there's a couple sentiments that have been raised in the chat on Pathable that and Bianca, I think, is kind of synthesizing that a little bit. But I think, she's just curious from you all and your perspective in terms of the challenges with USDA. And there might be some of you in the audience right now who work for USDA. I don't know. I haven't looked at everybody's affiliation, but I know sometimes sort of sound like they get beat up in this space. But I'd love to know, Bianca raises an important question, I think, about in terms of some of the challenges with navigating USDA resources. From your all's perspective, is it an issue of, people need better training to understand cultural differences, navigating those? How much of this is sort of racism in implicit, tacit, and very explicit, and how much of it is sort of giving people training who have been historically kind of marginalized in navigating complicated bureaucracies. You know, Bianca asked the question, is it all of those? My sense is, you know, there's a bit of all of that going on, but I'd love from your all's perspective and maybe kind of framing it in a asset model, but like what would be, you know, in your dream world, how could we support USDA better to be working with these more diverse communities? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Tony, can I ask you a question
Yeah.
that goes to this? Do you find that when you're working with USDA employees that sometimes you have to explain their programs to them?
That is correct. Yep. Yes,
Okay.
we have that. Yeah. Better understanding of their own programs. Translation of documents seems like that should have been done yesterday, kind of a thing. English is not the only spoken language in our country, and there's a lot of other very languages that are spoken a lot. But also, yeah, I think it's for us, it's more of a mix of teaching some of these producers how to interact with USDA, but also USDA or any of these grant programs need to understand that there is an appetite out there by other producers, you know, socially disadvantaged, historically excluded, whatever group we're talking about here, all of these groups, to be involved in the work that USDA is doing. And really the goal here is that they are serving those producers that want to be part of their program. So as making that, you know, I'm a huge advocate for plain language, and it's hard enough to not have plain language in a lot of these documents because legally we can't have plain language. But, you know, if we have people in these offices that can explain things in plain language, that would be probably the biggest step forward.
You know, it's funny. We have experienced around the easement program in particular. It is a complicated program for most of NRCS folks to understand. We have been in situations where we've actually had NRCS staff say, oh, it's not a good program for our county. It's not a good program for this area, because they don't understand the program. We have put on joint trainings with NRCS around the programs for their program staff to help them understand. And it baffles me. And that's a polite word that I'll use for what happens when we introduce the idea to a landowner of possibly looking at putting an ale easement on their property, and then they reach out to NRCS and they're told something completely different. One, it makes us look like we're incompetent. Well, why would you tell us a program that's not going to work for us? I talked to USDA and they said no. And two, it begins to build another set of barriers between landowners and USDA and technical assistance providers when we all can't agree that these programs were designed for them, meant to be used. I agree that it's all about how you approach it and how you explain it to the landowner, and being able to be honest with them about the pros and cons of each one of the programs, and not try to sell pie in the sky. But for me, to answer your question, Bianca, I think the challenge is that USDA for many years was understaffed, and then they started to staff up, and they staffed up with people who don't necessarily have the training they need to work with small acreage farmers who have a different set of challenges. It's not that they don't want to, it's that they haven't gotten, you know, it's like being a newborn. You have to crawl before you walk. No matter how badly you want to walk, you still have to crawl first, or most children do. Let me reframe that. And what happens is many of our farmers that we work with, our landowners, are so far below the minimum requirement for program participation that they can't participate in the program. So it's not because they don't want to, it's not because they are unable to, it's because they don't meet the baseline criteria. And that's a policy issue. And I would raise to everyone that, you know, the policy is we're going into this farm bill in 2023. We need to look at the farm bill to make sure that as the policies are being written, they don't force us who are technical assistance providers to have to be reactionary to policies that they've written that make no sense, like the perpetual language and the perpetual easement. You can't do more than 2% impervious surface in ours, which, you know, if that works fine for the family in 2010, but what happens to that family in 2030 when they have more children and people want to come back to the farm? Where are they supposed to live in? Yerkes?
My mother is a big fan of yours, Ebony.
I am too.
Well, I love this conversation. I want to give some time for breakouts, but Marie's had her hand up for a while. So Marie, I'll give you a chance to jump in, ask your question, and then we'll plan to do a little breakout with our guests and myself to just further kind of discuss how this work is connecting to your own work, your own challenges, or your own successes. Go ahead, Marie.
Hi. So I actually, I worked for NRCS for 10 years as a soil con and a soil scientist, and I cannot echo more what you guys have said about the difficulty of accessing programs. It's one of the reasons I left NRCS 6 years ago, is because I'm kind of a go-getter. I'm surprised, Tony, that I've never met you, because I've worked in Dane County for 6 years now. I've worked on groundswell projects. I've done a lot of work with some of your easements, some really good work actually. But it was so frustrating to always be kind of told like how to say no to farmers. I got real fed up with it. I still do administer USDA. I administer EQIP in my current job. I have a relationship with NRCS. However, it is, as someone who's done it for a very, very long time, they're not giving, USDA and NRCS are not giving their employees any room for subjective decision making. Everything is run through a computer program that tells us what we can and cannot do. And the computer program is designed, however it was designed, to knock out small farms, period. Like small or non-conventional or not running things this. I mean, and this goes for, I would say, even some of our bigger non-conventional conventional farms, if that makes sense, right? We've got lots of producers that are very large doing non-conventional things, and it is not a good fit. And so it's a problem. I don't know if it's a problem at the national or state level. Who's deciding why, as educated professionals and people who want to help landowners, why all of our decision making has been taken away from us and given to spreadsheets and computers. And so and I will also say that, like, in general, the morale of NRCS is very, very low. And that's not helping anyone. Those are my 2 cents as a previous employee.
Thank you for reflecting that, Marie. And I think your last point is, I think, a really important one, is morale and capacity. And we're just going to see perhaps even more, there's more and more money and programmatically, USDA is trying to get more money out to do a lot of the things that all of us are excited and passionate about. But there is the kind of human component of actually rolling out those programs and getting them to reach the folks who they need to reach, and what a challenge that would be, which I think is the kind of call to action for many of us in this space, that there'll be even more opportunities to be that gatekeeper and that sort of bridge builder between USDA agencies and the communities that we work with. And it's I don't know, that challenge is going to get easier given capacity, morale, and need for broader training. So I appreciate that reflection. So I'd love to, we're going to take 15-minute breakouts. Beth can give you a little more instruction. It's going to be pretty easy, but we're going to go into some rooms, and I would love for, I mean, really, so Tony, myself, and Ebony will be in 3 different rooms, and we're going to just be randomly assigned. But the questions that I'd love for you all to just kind of ponder in those breakouts is, you know, how are you working with socially disadvantaged farmers or landowners, historically excluded producers? Are there barriers that you're facing? Are you having success? Are you implementing innovative programs? Let's just use this as a chance to have a conversation that moves all of our collective work forward in this space. I just wanted to give a brief bit of time here for anyone to reflect on anything back to the larger group. You know, there were, I'm sure, lots of good conversations. I know we had good conversations of challenges, but also opportunities that people are navigating in their area. Anything people want to offer up from their group, or broader reflections that you think are valuable to bring to the full group?
Someone in our group was talking about having a lot of agricultural lands at their organization, who they have farmers leasing the property. So they're acting as a, you know, they are the landowner of the property, and they're looking for farmers, and they're saying, well, I wonder if I could just host, you know, socially disadvantaged or historically excluded farmers, and where can I build that network? How can I reach out to a network and invite those people onto the lands? And I didn't have an answer for that. We did have a nice answer from Carrie. Carrie looks like she's muted and away for a second. She mentioned some communities are tied to their churches, and one place would be to just go to the church and or reach out to the church and ask if they have any farmers that would like to, especially Black churches we were talking about. You know, that might be a place to start. I don't know, Carrie, if you had anything else to add to that.
It's a starting point to reach out to churches and faith-based organizations, as well as any type of, you know, social groups, fraternities, sororities. Those groups would have an opportunity to, you know, investigate that option a little bit more. So.
Anything emerging from your group that you want to offer up or reflect on?
Who were you talking to?
Oh,
I
sorry, I was
think
just
I got-
asking Ebony, was I on mute? Sorry. Ebony, I was just asking if you had anything you want to reflect on from your group discussion.
Well, Chris, what do you think? I mean, we covered a lot. I think that the challenge that we recognize is that, you know, land is a finite commodity, and it's our farmland is shrinking, and we're competing against so many other things and trying to preserve that farmland. We left our conversation actually talking about urban ag and what the impact urban ag is going to have on rural ag. And there's a distinct difference between the two.
And I think that's a really important point. And I think that there is this sort of assumption in some parts of USDA that urban equates to historically excluded producers, right? And that if they talk about urban, they are necessarily benefiting BIPOC farmers. And I think there's this sort of like, I think Ebony's point is so important, which is to say you are missing out on any number of historically, I love that term historic. I mean, I don't love it in a, I like that it is more accurate, the historically excluded producers, but to recognize that that does not equate to urban, and that needs to be an education of folks within USDA as well as outside of it.
And I guess the thing I would reflect back from our group was really on this theme that I know Ebony loves to talk about, as do I, of this sort of the small farm, just again, on the themes, I think a little bit about the need for working with smaller producers, but how, in the easement world, how tricky that can be in terms of, federal requirements and again, getting at this tension that, I was reflecting on. We've got a lot of resources continuing to come from USDA. There's renewed resources for climate smart agriculture. And there's been a push to sort of integrate more socially disadvantaged, historically excluded producers, but that doesn't mean we've necessarily changed the structure of the programs to actually include them. So we say we want to reach them, but we're not actually necessarily creating the conditions to include them. Same in some of the commodity work. While we don't often have as many diverse producers in the commodity world for a lot of the structural reasons we talk about, but we say we want to bring them into the fold. But what structural ways are we actually facilitating their engagement? So there's definitely some policy pieces here, but I know, at least my reflection as part of our work and partnership with NRCS through funding this work and others is I at least see us, and I think probably many of you all, to be able to have some of these conversations, to raise the issue, to raise the challenges, and to look for the ways that those intersections might shift, or we might be able to move the needle in terms of how this work gets done in the future around easement and soil health work. So it's at least something on our charge to do. But I recognize we're just about at time. I know, Beth, if you wanted to reflect on anything else, I definitely want to appreciate my panelists and both Ebony and Tony for their time and wearing dual roles as participants in the training, but also experts here. And wonderful to have you all just in this conversation. I always get something new out of it myself. So thank you both.